In the Damnation Game, characters go on spiritual journeys and then are delivered back into their flesh and feel the flesh solidifying around them like cooling fat. It's not a very attractive image. But certainly, I have dreams. I go on dream journeys when waking from them seems to be delivered back into this mundane, dull solidity.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Baron, this is your Brain on Books, and today I have another Clive Barker review, and we're talking about The Damnation Game. This was Barker's first published full-length novel, obviously very impactful for his career, but also just the horror genre in general. This was a big deviation from a lot of the standard frameworks and characters and writing style that was popular at the time in the 1980s and really made waves. There was a lot of really positive critical acclaim for this book. Took notice from Stephen King and even Neil Gaiman, when he was a columnist at the time, wrote a glowing review for this book. And I think it is a book that's not talked about very much, not just amongst horror fans, but also Clive Barker fans. And I kind of want to hopefully put it back on people's radar, because this does something that's very unique. I wouldn't say it's Barker's strongest work, but as a first effort at a full-length novel, I think it's very impressive. And I really want to talk about, aside from my general impressions and kind of what the story is, what is exclusively different about this, kind of what did it do to influence the horror genre at the time. So before we get into all that, let's just briefly touch on what this book is about. And it follows a convict named Marty, who is in prison, basically has lost all hope of ever getting out, or at least anytime soon, and he is given a very unusual offer from a man named Joseph Whitehead. Now, Whitehead is a man of great wealth and influence, and he has arranged for Marty to be removed from prison to carry out the remainder of his sentence in Whitehead's home, his mansion, his haven. But there's some unusual terms here. Marty is expected to be Whitehead's bodyguard. Now, the threat or the reason that he is in danger is not clear, but Marty is so desperate to be removed from prison that he takes the deal. So from there, you're really following Marty's day-to-day life, his path of redemption, and him discovering the source of Whitehead's wealth and kind of what existential threat he's under. Which is a very different kind of framework than what we see in other Barker books. Barker books are very much these big, large scope, portal fantasy, jumping around to a lot of settings. This is not that. This is a very isolated setting. It's a very claustrophobic setting, and it really adds to this unease and atmosphere throughout the remainder of the novel. So we're going to leave it at that. I don't want to give any particular spoilers here, but of course this has a lot of the elements that we associate with Clive Barker, like the romantic subplots and the deep themes and some of the grotesque imagery. All of that is present here. However, it's maybe not as fully fleshed out as it is in some of his grander later works, like, a Magica or Book of the Art, etc. So I mentioned that this is a big change up in the horror genre for the time, and I think understanding that really lets you understand why this book is important, or if it's worth your time. And the first one is characters. So one thing that was very, I should say, the norm for this day, and even in horror fiction now, is the good versus evil. And a lot of contemporaries of Clive Barker, like John Saul or Ramsey Campbell or Stephen King, they really relied on that good versus evil. So if I take an example from Stephen King, we say like The Stand, you have Stu and Larry are the good guys versus Flag and the Trash Can Man, are your bad guys. And then you'll have these little spattering of different characters that have these distortions to their personalities that make them terrifying or creepy. Like for The Stand, that would be the kid. That's a disgusting character. It's repulsive. It makes it feel horrific. Okay? This book doesn't do that. This book has what people commonly refer to now as morally gray characters, a term that I think is personally overused and kind of ambiguous. However, I think that's you can kind of get the point of what I'm trying to say from this. Every single character here is inherently evil. Now, you might sympathize with their search for meaning, their path to redemption. However, you're going to be constantly conflicted about how you feel these characters, and your opinions on who's the antagonist, who's the protagonist is going to shift. Just because somebody has the most amount of page time does not mean that they are the hero or the righteous of this story. That's not what Barker does at all, and that's kind of a trademark of his later works. However, I think the Damnation Game really pushes this as far as it can go. Because in early Barker, there's an angst in this. This is a very nihilistic book, and it's dark, and each character, I think, fully represents that. Another thing that's just completely different is the writing style. Now, a lot of more generic horror authors at the time, let's say like Dean Koontz, and I mentioned Ramsey Campbell, or even if we're sticking with English horror with John Saul, have this very utilitarian way of writing. Everything is almost like a crime noir novel with kind of some supernatural elements, maybe some creepy ick factor that makes it horror, but it stays kind of linear with other areas of genre fiction. This doesn't do that at all. This is the first introduction of Barker's prose, and I think his prose definitely improved later on, especially with like Weave World, but nonetheless, there's a flamboyance here. There is a borderline verbose quality and literary quality to the way he writes that is just not the norm. And I think more than anything, that's what blew people away with this book, is you have this almost classical Gothic horror and real literature that is poured through these pages while still not going too far away from what people are used to, with say something like a Stephen King book. And the last thing that this does that was also not really prevalent at the time, and I think probably I could say that would be the case now too, is themes. Barker has heavy philosophical themes in here. Some of it's on the nose, not as much in this stuff. In the later works, that's definitely the case. But in this, you can really see Barker's hate of materialism, his disdain towards institutional control, and hedonism is kind of the primary theme across all of his books, and kind of the corruption that comes from somebody's desire. And although I think it's explored better in other works, especially like in Imagica, which really dives into that to like the nth degree, the Damnation Game is starting to present those ideas. People are starting to see what Barker's about, what direction he wants to take his stories. And when you really combine this literary writing style, this kind of rich, dark themes, plus these characters that are really used more as a vessel to present the themes rather than your more like Stephen King style character, you have something that's very different, really was refreshing at the time. And I think if you're a Barker fan, you should try this book out. If you're just a fan of horror books, you should check this out because it's very different. And I think it's great. I didn't read this as my first Clive Barker book. I think this is like the 5th or 6th one I've read. And I often get asked kind of what's the best place to start with him. And I think if you're coming from a place of reading a lot of horror, this is a good place to start. If you've read The Shining and Salem's Lot and all these kind of, big hit Stephen King books, and you want to say, I don't want to veer away from that too much, but I want to try something a little bit different, this would be a good book to pick up. So I'm going to leave it just at that. I plan on reviewing other Barker books in the future. I've already done Weave World and Imagica. If there's any particular titles you're interested in, leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to take a crack at it. But until next time, see ya.